Today I'm going to lecture about ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? In order for us to continue in our semester of discussing all the impacts of what we've done on Earth, we first must really understand how ecosystems work in the first place. So once we have an understanding of those interactions and how ecosystems function, then we can see how changes and things that we've done impact those ecosystems. So that's where we're going to start our discussion this week and into next week. So let's start with some background terminology. Let's define an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a group of plants, animals, and microbes occupying a unit of space and interacting with each other. For example, a wetland or a forest ecosystem. Okay, we know plants, animals, but we don't want to forget about all the microbes, the microscopic organisms, the fungus, the bacteria, all of those other organisms that play an integral part in their ecosystems. Okay, wetland ecosystems, forest ecosystems, etc. When we think about biomes, biomes kind of expand from there, where we have similar or related ecosystems grouped together to form major kinds of ecosystems. For example, we might have a tropical rainforest in the Amazon, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a tropical rainforest somewhere else. So biomes are these ecosystems around the world that have similar characteristics that we group together and we call a biome. Okay, finally here we have what we call the biosphere, or the one vast ecosystem, which is our Earth ecosystem. And keep in mind, and this is something that we'll kind of come back to throughout the semester, is that we are all interconnected and interdependent. Okay, all of our ecosystems are tied in to others throughout the world. And just because something happens in one ecosystem doesn't mean that it won't impact some other ecosystem. So keep that in mind, and we will, of course, come back to that throughout the semester and at the very end when we talk about global issues. So let's continue our discussion of ecosystem structure. When we think about ecosystem structure, we really break it down into two main categories, our biotic factors and our abiotic factors. When we think about biotic factors, think of bio as obviously living. When we think about biology, we think of the study of living things. So when we talk about ecosystems, generally what comes into our mind are the biotic factors, the living things in the environment or the organisms that live there, the plants, the animals, the microbes, etc. And obviously they're a huge part of the ecosystem structure. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we'll kind of flip to the other side and talk about what we call abiotic factors, which are the non-living parts of the environment. And they also play a huge role in ecosystem structure and function. When we think about biotic factors, we really look at what we call the trophic structure. And the trophic structure is really the food web or the feeding relationships among species. Okay, we know that all living things must get energy in some way, and they either eat or they produce food through photosynthesis and then respire it to make energy that they can use in their body. So the trophic structure is really how we look at those relationships or the ecology in the ecosystem. We break our trophic structure into three different parts: our producer category, our consumer category, and finally our decomposers and detritus feeders. So let's talk about our producers first. Our producers are also called autotrophs. Okay, and autotrophs have the ability to make their own food. Okay, unlike what we call a heterotroph, that we would fall into that category. Okay, producers or autotroph use energy from the sun or chemicals to convert carbon dioxide into organic matter. All right, producers use energy from the sun or chemicals to convert CO2, or carbon dioxide, into organic matter. And we generally think of producers as photosynthesizers. Okay, so we know our photosynthesis reaction. They take carbon dioxide, light, and water, and they convert that into glucose, and they release oxygen. Okay, so they have the ability to do that, to make their own food. They, generally speaking, are not consumers. Okay, they don't have to consume their food. So usually I get a question from a student about, well, what about those few species that actually are consumers? Our plants that we think of, like our Venus flytrap, that eat, okay, that trap flies and consume them. That is true. But if a Venus flytrap never caught a fly, it would still live because it's a green plant and it does get most of its food from photosynthesis. Okay, the important part about producers in the food web is that they are really responsible for sustaining all other organisms in their ecosystem. So without producers, okay, life really couldn't exist on our planet. They produce all the energy, the food and energy, that sustains all other life on the planet. So they're able to do that, and anybody else really needs to derive their food from producers. Okay, next we're talking about consumers, and we fall into this category. We are heterotrophs. We do not have the ability to make our own food. We can't put our hands up in the air. We're not green. We can't harness light energy. We can't photosynthesize. Therefore, we are consumers. We must consume our food. We kind of break consumers into different categories. We say you can be a primary consumer where you feed directly on producers, or you can be what we call a secondary consumer that feeds on other consumers. So if I am a vegetarian, I am a primary consumer. If I am a wolf that only eats meat, I'm a carnivore. I am purely a secondary consumer. And many people are what we call an omnivore, which you could fall into both categories because not only do we eat plants and vegetables, but we also eat meat. In the consumer category, we can go from primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, but we don't typically get much higher than that because of energy loss, and we'll talk about that later when we really focus in on that energy transfer. Under consumer category, we also want to include organisms like parasites that feed on hosts. Okay, they are dependent on hosts. Without a host, they can't survive. So we categorize them often as consumers. Okay, our final category here are very important, are decomposers and detritus feeders. And they're going to be very important when we talk about recycling nutrients, etc., a little bit later on. Decomposers and detritus feeders feed on dead organic matter. Okay, remember organic matter, we're talking about carbon. All living things contain carbon, and therefore we call that organic matter. Decomposers and detritus feeders feed on detritus, or dead organic matter, leaves, grass, trees, fecal waste, dead animals. All right, any kind of waste, these guys, take care of. They decompose that material. Examples would be worms, termites, ants, etc. And they're important, like I said, because they recycle nutrients back into earth, and plants use those nutrients. So they're really important recyclers in ecosystems. When we talk about food webs show energy flow in ecosystems. So what you'll notice in the diagram of the food web, you'll see that the movement of energy is represented by the arrows. So when you see the deer on the bottom left, the deer is eating grasses, and the energy is moving from the grasses to the deer, and from the deer to the tick, for example, or from the grass up to the eastern cottontail, or from the grasses up to the deer mouse, up to the rat snake. So this is important as we talk about energy and ecosystems and the movement, as well as when you do your activity with food webs. Keep in mind that you are showing the movement of energy. We have a tendency to arrow down from the organism that is consuming something. For example, from that secondary consumer to the primary consumer. But it's actually the reverse, okay, because like I said, the food web is showing the movement of energy, and that's moving up through food webs. Next, I want to discuss biomass. Bio, like we said, is living things, so mass of living things in the environment. We're talking about the total combined weight of all organisms at each trophic level. And this is demonstrated by what we call a biomass pyramid. And as you can see, you have grass, grasshopper, some kind of rodent, and then an owl at the top of that food chain or food web. When we look at our pyramid, that's kind of how it's just really a representation of what's really going on in our ecosystems. At the producer level, we have the most biomass, and as we move up that trophic structure to the from the producers to the primary consumer, to the secondary consumer, to the tertiary consumer, the biomass actually decreases. And if we think about it, it makes sense, because obviously an owl isn't only going to eat one rodent, and a rodent is only going to eat one grasshopper, and a grasshopper is only going to eat one blade of grass. Clearly, to support an owl at the top of the food chain in this scenario, it must consume multiple rats every day that consume multiple insects every day that consume multiple producers each day. So the biomass has to be the largest at the base of that food chain in order to support all of those consumers above it. It's that shaped pyramid representation of that relationship. On the left of the diagram that I have here on this slide, you'll see the measurement of kilocalories, or we generally just call that a calorie, and you'll see how that decreases by really 90% as we move up that chain. And that will be important a little bit later when we talk about the relationship between energy at these different levels, okay, as energy is transferred up the food chain, how that changes, and that'll be important a little bit later. Calorie, or scientifically we call it kilocalorie, is a measurement of energy. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll come back to that. As I stated earlier, we need to not only discuss the biotic parts of the environment, we have to also consider the abiotic factors and the non-living parts of our environment, the physical and chemical parts of the environment instead of just biological. When we think about abiotic factors, we think about water, nutrient, temperature, climate, precipitation, humidity. All of these things are the abiotic factors. The soil, okay, minus the biotic parts of it. All right, the water in the soil. Okay, all of these things play a part in ecosystems. Clearly, storms and floods and all of those things are going to influence what an environment is like. Okay, we know that's what determines whether an environment is a wetland ecosystem or a desert. So this is really important when we discuss what's happening in those ecosystems, because these absolutely impact what kind of organisms can live there. So let's define a few things. The first thing is the optimal range. Okay, we say organisms fall into their optimal range when factors or environmental conditions are really right for them. Okay, they are optimal, we say. Okay, the environmental conditions in which an organism does the best. So organisms are going to be sensitive to a lot of different things. They're going to be sensitive to the temperature. They're going to be sensitive to the amount of water they have, the many nutrients they have. All of these things are going to play a role in how well an organism can do in its environment. How hot or cold it is, what the pH of the water is. All of these different factors. So organisms have things that they prefer. So they like a pH of water to be around 8. They like the temperature of water to be around 70 degrees. They want a high dissolved oxygen content. So it just depends on what organism you are and where you are in your ecosystem. Clearly, you can live there, but you do your best. You're going to eat, be able to feed the best. You're going to be able to reproduce the best when all of these conditions that your body requires are met. And that's really what the optimal range is about. I think we can all agree that when it's really hot out, we may not feel at our best. Okay, we might not feel like exercising outside as much. Okay, we also could probably say when it's really super cold in Michigan, maybe we're feeling not like our best. Okay, when our internal body temperature is elevated above our optimal range, we feel stressed out. Okay, we feel like our body is not right. Everything isn't working properly. Okay, that is a big concern. Okay, we have what we call a range of tolerance. So we have the optimal range, and that's kind of like perfect conditions. But we also have what we call the range that will tolerate. Okay, we might get really hot. We'll tolerate it, but we might not function as well. Our internal body temperature might get to 99, 100, and well, it's not going to kill us. We can tolerate it, but we're not functioning at our optimum. Okay, so the range of tolerance includes that optimal range, but extends to what organisms can tolerate. Okay, we can still grow, but maybe not as well. We can still reproduce, but maybe not as many offspring. Okay, it's okay. We're doing all right. It's in our tolerance range, but it's not as perfect as if, all of these factors kind of came together. And we see this in ecosystems, and it's going to be something we discuss as we see, the impacts that we're having on our ecosystems, the stress that we're putting organisms under. When we take away their habitat, that stresses them out. They don't have the space they need. When an organism is wiped out of an area, that causes stress within the food web, and maybe somebody's not going to have the food they need, or a population isn't going to be controlled by a predator. When we think about, fish tanks, we have to monitor pH, temperature. We have to make sure we provide oxygen for our fish. Okay, they're very sensitive to these things, and we know if they're out of balance, we can push our organisms outside their range of tolerance, and then they die. So when we see, massive fish kills, for example, it might be where everything looks fine, and then one day there's just fish floating. And what can happen is one of their factors, it could be something as simple as oxygen is fine. And the oxygen is dropping a little bit, and the fish are becoming more stressed, but they're still functioning. And all of a sudden the dissolved oxygen falls to a level they can no longer tolerate, and they all die. So we see this in systems where our organisms become stressed. They're in their tolerance range, but they're on the brink. And then it takes a little tiny push of what we call like a tipping point, and then bam, they can't tolerate it anymore. And again, we're so affected by so many abiotic factors, species out there. So again, something to keep in mind as we move forward. Can we call these factors limiting factors? Because as you know, if a plant is trying to photosynthesize and produce food or glucose so it can grow and reproduce and do all the things that it needs, if you limit one of the things it needs to do that, well, guess what? It's going to limit what it can do. So, for example, we know plants need, all kinds of things: light, water. They need carbon dioxide. Okay, you can pump them up with carbon dioxide, pump them up with water. But if you put them in the dark, that's going to be their limiting factor, and they're not going to be able to grow. And it could stress them out enough that they die. They need nutrients. If they get the wrong balance of nutrients, it's going to limit what they can do. Okay, so anything that limits an organism from doing what it needs to be doing, whether it's growth, reproduction, healing, all those types of things, any organism. We call that the limiting factor. And really the range of tolerance and optimal range both relate to those factors. Okay, so I want to do a quick review of chemistry to make sure we're all on the same page. This is on the outline that I supplied you on Moodle, so you can take a look at that. It will all be listed on there. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, so as we move forward, when I relate to these things, you understand how they relate to our topic. Alright, we know that all living things are made up of matter, and all matter is composed of atoms. Remember, we're talking about those atoms that contain a nucleus, that contain neutrons and protons, and around the outside of the atom is the orbiting electrons. Alright, this matter is pretty much cataloged on our periodic table as elements. Alright, so if you take a look at your periodic table, you'll see hydrogen, helium, etc. With their atomic number, which is the number of protons. And you'll see that there are 94 naturally occurring elements, and then there's additional ones that we've been able to produce in the lab by adding their subatomic particles. We will talk about elements because they absolutely are part of the abiotic, well, for the most part, abiotic part of our system when we think about nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. And of course, when we talk about organic chemistry, we're talking about organic or organisms. We're talking about carbon. Remember, carbon is the element of living things. Alright, something important to us is what we call the law of conservation of matter. It states that atoms are neither created or destroyed during a chemical reaction. Alright, atoms from the environment are incorporated into organisms who create waste products through feces or death, and these atoms are recycled back into the environment. So the law of conservation of matter states that all that matter is always here. Okay, it's not created or destroyed, it's just converted into another form. So when we think about chemical energy, for example, our glucose molecule, okay, that is our chemical energy. And when we break apart our glucose to derive energy in the form of ATP, that energy is released. Those elements are still there, that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. They're still there, but they convert into another form. Okay, released are carbon dioxide and water. Okay, those elements, you'll see glucose has carbons, hydrogen, and oxygens, and then on our other side of our reaction, a respiration reaction, you'll see those resulting waste products of water and carbon dioxide. So when we think about it, all of those elements are going to be conserved, okay, in our reactions along the way. Okay, this is part of that whole sustainability thing. We know that in nature everything kind of comes and goes and comes and goes. And there's a nice balance there. Our concern is that the way that we are making changes is that we're kind of offsetting the balance. And when we talk about natural systems where, you know, atoms are incorporated into organisms and waste products are produced and then they're recycled back, you know, we're producing waste that is not getting recycled back. So that's a concern. It's all conserved, but where is it conserved is the question. Where does it end up? And is it going to offset the balance of systems? Okay, the law of conservation of matter. Atoms are neither created or destroyed. They are conserved, but can change form. Okay, when we talk about molecules and compounds, a molecule is made up of two or more atoms. Think about all those atoms, those elements bonded together. Those atoms can be the same or different. So we can have hydrogen and oxygen to form water molecules, or we could have two elemental oxygen together to make O2, or our oxygen that we breathe. So we have water or O2, H2O or O2, and those are both molecules because, again, the atoms can be different, like H and O to make water, or they can be the same, like two O's to make diatomic oxygen. Okay, a compound is made up of two or more different atoms bonded together. So oxygen, O2, is not a compound. A compound must have at least two different elements together. Okay, so again, not something that I'm going to drill home, but I just want to make sure we're all familiar with the same terminology moving forward. So let's move forward and talk about the chemistry of living things, or the chemistry of life. Living things are composed of the following elements: nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. Okay, sometimes we say N-CHOPS, okay, as a way to remember these different elements that are incorporated together to produce, okay, to make living things. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other elements in our bodies, but these are the major ones that we think of. Like I said, with glucose, C6H12O6, okay, we're talking about having carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and glucose is such an important carbohydrate for us. When we combine these elements in different ways, we make up the four biological molecules of living things. All right, biological molecules, sometimes we call them macromolecules or biochemicals. All of these terms are really synonymous with each other. Macromolecules, these big molecules, biological molecules, or you can even hear them called biochemicals because they are the chemistry of living things. Like I said, four of them. The first one, and you'll be familiar with these, is proteins. When we think about proteins we know are so important in our body to build strong muscle, to have healthy, integumentary system, our hair, our skin, our nails. Really important that we consume the proper amount of protein in our diet. And of course, other organisms, protein is important as well. In addition to all these things that I just mentioned, enzymes are also proteins, and they are absolutely essential to living things. They make reactions happen that would not happen on their own fast enough. So they fall into this major category. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids, so often you'll hear amino acid complex when you see shampoo commercials, or certainly if you consume extra protein to build muscle, etc., you will hear this discussed. Okay, the second category there is carbohydrates, and when you hear carbs, immediately we think of energy, and that is really the purpose of consuming carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are an important part of our diet in moderation to supply that energy that we need. The glucose molecule is a sugar. Okay, the building blocks of carbohydrates are sugars. So when we think about the sugar that plants produce in photosynthesis, that glucose sugar, that is really the foundation of life on the planet. We need that energy that is produced by plants, that sugar, that chemical energy, to really allow those plants to function and do all the things they need to do: growth, healing, reproducing, all the things that the plant does. And then we consume that plant to, again, derive energy from it. So carbohydrates, the building blocks being sugars, we think about monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides, starches, cellulose in plants. All of those things are carbohydrates, and again, important giant molecule that that is essential to living things. All right, the third one I have there are lipids. We think of lipids as our fats, the building blocks being glycerols and fatty acids. We think about fats as often a negative thing, but fats are an important part of the diet. They come in different categories like saturated and unsaturated. We know that unsaturated fats are the healthier fats. the liquids at room temperatures, like are at room temperature. For example, olive oil is a healthier item to cook with than, for example, a saturated solid. For example, like butter. So lipids, again, they seem like, sometimes we think not so healthy, but, having a certain amount of unsaturated fats in your diet is important, okay? We need to have insulation in our body. We need to have cushion for our organs. We need to have long-term energy. And basically, having a little bit of fat storage, we can draw on that fat if we need to for energy. We can break it down and use it for energy in our body. Okay, finally, nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are in everything we consume because we consume organic matter. All living things in the cells of their bodies have nucleic acids. Okay, our nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. These are our genetic material. So any living thing is going to have genetic material. Whether it's very simple or very complex, all of them will have it. So this is not something you'll see on your nutrition label, because all living things have nucleic acids, and we take those in and we rearrange them, and we can produce our own nucleic acids in our body, our DNA and RNA. Okay, very important. Nucleic acids, the building blocks being nucleotides, and in your bio class, I'm sure you've discussed the sugar phosphate backbone and the double helix of DNA, for example, and the nitrogenous bases that make that up. So that's what we're talking about here, that fourth biochemical nucleic acids. But the biosphere we talked about earlier is all the living organisms and their abiotic components. So the biosphere, this vast ecosystem that we have on Earth. And we break down our biosphere into three categories, what we call the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. The lithosphere is the Earth's crust and the rocky materials of the Earth, the terrestrial environment, the actual Earth. The hydrosphere, as you can probably figure out, is our marine, our ocean environment, our streams, our lakes, our aquatic systems. All of our water, whether it's frozen or liquid or gas. All right, when we think about our atmosphere, the atmosphere is going to be the gases between the Earth and outer space. Okay, so from the lithosphere all the way up to outer space is what we term the atmosphere. And we break that into two categories that will be important for us here in our discussions, the troposphere and the stratosphere. The troposphere is down here at Earth's surface. It's the air that we breathe. And obviously that is an area of concern if we have air pollutants that impact us. The stratosphere is up by outer space. And this is where, for example, our ozone layer is, our protective ozone layer, our stratospheric ozone.